deserved reputation by dying prematurely. Had he lived, it is probable that he would either have been thrown out, like Trotsky, or would have kept himself in power by methods as barbarous, or nearly as barbarous, as those of Stalin. The title of Burnham's essay, therefore, sets forth a reasonable thesis, and one would expect him to support it by an appeal to the facts. However, the essay barely touches upon its ostensible subject matter. It is obvious that anyone genuinely concerned to show that there has been continuity of policy, as between Lenin and Stalin, would start by outlining Lenin's policy, and then explain in what way Stalin's has resembled it. Burnham does not do this. Except for one or two cursory sentences, he says nothing about Lenin's policy, and Lenin's name only occurs 5 times in an essay of 12 pages. In the first 7 pages, apart from the title, it does not occur at all. The real aim of the essay is to present Stalin as a towering, superhuman figure, indeed a species of demigod, and Bolshevism as an irresistible force which is flowing over the earth and cannot be halted until it reaches the outermost borders of Eurasia. Insofar as he makes any attempt to prove his case, Burnham does so by repeating over and over again that Stalin is, quote-unquote, a great man, which is probably true, but is almost completely irrelevant. Moreover, though he does advance some solid arguments for believing in Stalin's genius, it is clear that in his mind the idea of greatness, quote-unquote, is inextricably mixed up with the idea of cruelty and dishonesty. There are curious passages in which it seems to be suggested that Stalin is admired because of the limitless suffering that he has caused. Quote, Stalin proves himself to be a quote-unquote great man in the grand style. The accounts of the banquets staged in Moscow for the visiting dignitaries set the symbolic tone. With their enormous menus of sturgeon and roasts and fowl and sweets, their streams of liquor, the scores of toasts with which they end, the silent, unmoving secret police behind each guest, all against the winter background of the starving multitudes of besieged Leningrad, the dying millions at the front, the jammed concentration camps, the city crowds kept by their minute rations just at the edge of life, there is little trace of dull mediocrity or the hand of Babbitt. We recognize, rather, the tradition of the most spectacular of the Tsars, of the great kings of the Medes and Persians, of the Khanate of the Golden Horde, of the banquet we assign to the gods of the heroic ages in tribute to the insight that insolence, indifference, and brutality on such a scale remove beings from the human level. Stalin's political techniques show a freedom from conventional restrictions that is incompatible with mediocrity. The mediocre man is custom-bound. Often it is the scale of his operations that sets them apart. It is usual, for example, for men active in practical life to engineer an occasional frame-up. But to carry out a frame-up against tens of thousands of persons, important percentages of whole strata of society, including most of one's own comrades, is so far out of the ordinary that the long-run mass conclusion is either that the frame-up must be true, at least, quote, have some truth in it, unquote, or that power so immense must be submitted to is an, quote-unquote, historical necessity, as intellectuals put it. There is nothing unexpected in letting a few individuals starve for reasons of state, but to starve by deliberate decision several millions is a type of action attributed ordinarily only to gods, unquote. In these and other similar passages there may be a tinge of irony, but it is difficult not to feel that there is also a sort of fascinated admiration. Towards the end of the essay, Burnham compares Stalin with those semi-mythical heroes, like Moses or Ahsoka, who embody in themselves a whole epoch, and can justly be credited with feats that they did not actually perform. In writing of Soviet foreign policy and its supposed objectives, he touches an even more mystical note. Quote, starting from the magnetic core of the Eurasian heartland, the Soviet power, like the reality of the one, of Neoplatonism, overflowing in the descending series of the emanative progression, flows outward, west into Europe, south into the Near East, east into China, already lapping the shores of the Atlantic, the Yellow and China Seas, the Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf. As the undifferentiated one, in its progression, descends through the stages of mind, soul, and matter, and then through its fatal return back to itself, so does the Soviet power, emanating from the integrally totalitarian center, proceed outwards by absorption of the Baltics, Bessarabia, Bukovina, East Poland, for example, by domination of Finland, the Balkans, Mongolia, North China, and tomorrow Germany, for example, orienting influence of Italy, France, Turkey, Iran, Central and South China, for example, until it is dissipated in MHON, the outer material sphere, beyond the Eurasian boundaries of momentary appeasement and infiltration of England and the United States, for example. Unquote. I do not think it is fanciful to suggest that the unnecessary capital letters with which this passage is loaded are intended to have a hypnotic effect on the reader. Burnham is trying to build up a picture of terrifying, irresistible power, and to turn a normal political maneuver like infiltration into capital I infiltration adds to the general portentousness. The essay should be read in full. Although it is not the kind of tribute that the average Russophile would consider acceptable, and although Burnham himself would probably claim that he is being strictly objective, he is in effect performing an act of homage, and even of self-abasement. Meanwhile, this essay gives us another prophecy to add to the list, i.e., that the USSR will conquer the whole of Eurasia, and probably a great deal more. And one must remember that Burnham's basic theory contains in itself a prediction which still has to be tested. That is, that whatever else happens, the quote-unquote managerial form of society is bound to prevail. Burnham's earlier prophecy of a German victory in the war and the integration of Europe around the German nucleus was falsified, not only in its main outlines, but in some important details. Burnham insists all the way through that quote-unquote managerialism is not only more efficient than capitalist democracy or Marxian socialism, but also more acceptable to the masses. The slogans of democracy and national self-determination, he says, no longer have any mass appeal. Quote-unquote managerialism, on the other hand, can rouse enthusiasm, produce intelligible war aims, establish fifth columns everywhere, and inspire its soldiers with a fanatical morale. The quote-unquote fanaticism of the Germans, as against the quote-unquote apathy or quote-unquote indifference of the British, French, etc., is much emphasized, and Nazism is represented as a revolutionary force, sweeping across Europe and spreading its philosophy, quote, by contagion, unquote. The Nazi fifth columns, quote, cannot be wiped out, unquote, and the democratic nations are quite incapable of projecting any settlement which the German or other European masses would prefer to the new order. In any case, the democracies can only defeat Germany if they go, quote, still further along the managerial road than Germany has yet gone, unquote. The germ of truth in all this is that the smaller European states, demoralized by the chaos and stagnation of the pre-war years, collapsed rather more quickly than they need have done, and might conceivably have accepted the new order if the Germans had kept some of their promises. But the actual experience of German rule aroused almost at once such a fury of hatred and vindictiveness as the world has seldom seen. After about the beginning of 1941, there was hardly any need of a positive war aim, since getting rid of the Germans was a sufficient objective. The question of morale and its relation to national solidarity is a nebulous one, and the evidence can be so manipulated as to prove almost anything. But if one goes by the proportion of prisoners to other casualties and the amount of Quislingism, the totalitarian states came out of the comparison worse than the democracies. Hundreds of thousands of Russians appear to have gone over to the Germans during the course of the war, while comparable numbers of Germans and Italians had gone over to the Allies before the war started. The corresponding number of American or British renegades would have amounted to a few scores. As an example of the inability of quote-unquote capitalist ideologies to enlist support, Burnham cites, quote, the complete failure of voluntary military recruiting in England, as well as the entire British Empire, and in the United States, unquote. One would gather from this that the armies of the totalitarian states were manned by volunteers. Actually, no totalitarian state has ever so much as considered voluntary recruitment for any purpose, nor, throughout history, has a large army ever been raised by voluntary means. It is not worth listing the many similar arguments that Burnham puts forward. The point is that he assumes that the Germans must win the propaganda war as well as the military one, and that, at any rate in Europe, this estimate was not borne out by events. It will be seen that Burnham's predictions have not merely, when they were verifiable, turned out to be wrong, but that they have sometimes contradicted one another in a sensational way. It is this last fact that is significant. Political predictions are usually wrong because they are usually based on wish thinking, but they can have symptomatic value, especially when they change abruptly. Often the revealing factor is the date at which they are made. Dating Burnham's various writings as accurately as can be done from internal evidence, and then noting what events they coincided with, we find the following relationships. In The Managerial Revolution, Burnham prophesizes a German victory, postponement of the Russo-German War until after Britain is defeated, and, subsequently, the defeat of Russia. The book, or much of it, was written in the second half of 1940, i.e. at a time when the Germans had overrun Western Europe and were bombing Britain, and the Russians were collaborating with them fairly closely, in what appeared, at any rate, to be a spirit of appeasement. In the supplementary note added